I'm Carissa Carter, and my journey, I started out as a geologist. I had my undergraduate and first graduate degree was in the geosciences, and I worked as a geologist for a while. I was studying what's called geomorphology, which are the processes that shape the landscape. So rivers,
Oh,
glaciers, sand moving. And I think that geology is quite an interdisciplinary discipline as it stands, right? You need to be able to see the big picture of what's happening, but drill down to the mechanics of, how is that tiny sand grain bouncing over that one little ripple? And so this ability to zoom in and zoom out. I love being a geologist. My journey is
gives you
dotted.
perspective across time, right? I think that's something
Oh,
that's
yeah.
extraordinary, right? You've got this like massive timeline that you're looking at things through.
Right. I mean, I think that that's such a great point, right? Like if we think of Earth history and then which is, multiple billions of years down to recent millions, down to, like as a geologist, you are looking at these range of scales, range of processes. I think it's fascinating because those processes are actually like very mirrored to the skills you need to use as a designer. I didn't know design was a thing
Yeah.
until I was working as a geologist, right? Like, so I like come through, I was in a career when I realized that that was a possibility. It just wasn't something that I understood. I knew art. Um, I had done a bunch of art while I was an undergraduate as well, but again, didn't know the discipline of design really existed. And I think I got lucky in finding it. I had a number of wonderful mentors along the way that I would love to credit. I think the
Yeah.
people that shape us on our journeys, like they do so much more than they ever get credit for. And sometimes they don't even know that like that one sentence they said was the thing that shifted you. And I remember working at the USGS, and I was working with this sedimentologist. His name was David Rubin, and he said something along the lines of, you could continue down this geology route, right? Or, it's like you're interested in a lot of things. Like he opened up this possibility that I could go into this like space of looking at how things are made, how things are presented. I've always been interested in the presentation of information. It was just a freeing thing to have somebody that was a scientist say, hey, you could spend your career pursuing this tiny slice of truth. We need people to do that, right? But we also need people to be those connectors between the disciplines. And that was one main moment that helped me, make my way into graduate school for design after that. And and my story is as a designer for from that moment on. I got another degree in what was product design really at that time. So making things digital was starting to come to pass at that time. And I have worked as a designer since. And for the last 10 years or so, I have been at the Stanford D School, which is a place where we teach thousands of students every year how to apply creativity to their lives, how to be designers proper, how to create the next wave of the world.
Actually, isn't that how to design your life class? Is that the one that's at Stanford D
It
School?
is that's adjacent to the D school. Yeah, that came out of some faculty that work
Okay, yeah, got it.
near us.
'Cause it just hit me actually about that. I'm like, wait a second. So is the D School like its own? Like, does one get a degree from the D School, or is it that it's becomes a center for people who are studying humanities and sciences and everything else to take courses in or get a certificate in?
So it's both. The D School started as an interdisciplinary institute where students from all 7 schools at Stanford could come and take a design course, and then they would go back to wherever they were majoring.
Right.
2 years ago,
Uh,
we actually um, adopted and revamped the undergraduate and graduate degrees in design that Stanford had previously housed under mechanical engineering, and we reinvented them for the modern era. So we have been offering designs the last couple of years. Actually, we just had graduation yesterday. And so it has been a wild ride in deciding like what does a design degree look like today? Like,
Yeah.
who are we building this future for? How are we preparing students for jobs that like actually don't exist yet? And so that
Even
process,
for work, like a society in which work will look really different. Like to me, there's a much bigger conversation around all this stuff and how this all fits. But
oh
I will say,
yeah,
my middle son would have so loved finding you guys. Certainly as an undergraduate, I actually went and like checked out your graduate degree programs this morning before we jumped on because I'm like, oh my
yeah,
God, if he could ever find his way there. Like he is your kind of guy who's so curious
yeah.
about how the world works. Just as an aside, he and a friend who's an artist and a neuroscience student from Yale just spent 2 weeks in Chicago collecting 100,000 exoskeletons of cicadas for a big land art project that his friend Diego was going to go. He got all the exoskeletons for, he thinks of them as paint. He doesn't even know exactly what he's going to do with them yet, but he just wanted to have, while he had this moment in time, this very, very narrow moment in time, go collect as many as he could so that he would then be able to go do whatever he wants to go do with them over the next several years.
Oh, cool.
And Zane
Yeah.
became kind of like his producer of, and that was actually the really interesting conversation, just as total aside, right? In many environments, Zane is seen as a super creative person, but all of a sudden he was hanging out with really like deep artists, both Diego and some other people. They end up going to some university with, glass blowing and whatever. And Zane realized he was actually more the producer and more the strategist and the person who was thinking ahead of the next step they needed to go take. So I always think context is such an important part of this whole conversation about who you are and where you are. But I think your program is just really fascinating. And I'm wondering like how much design thinking and that whole conversation around design thinking was part of going alongside. And then you guys have just like what's happened to design thinking in this
I
world right now?
mean, I think so. Let me say, how about I answer it this way? When I say design, I mean like this thing, which is a cell phone I'm holding up, and you can hold up your own cell phone. Like this is a physical product that was designed. Somebody decided the materials that make it up, the radius of the corners, etc. It also has like it comes loaded with these digital products, right, that are on it. Somebody designed those. They did the graphics, they did the UI flow, like all product design. Of course, like these products enable any number of experiences to happen. So you can have a video call with somebody on the other side of the world, like somebody designed that experience. Each of those experiences is embedded in any number of systems that we have. So as a Stanford University employee, like they give me this phone and I'm a cog in that system. I have to have the software loaded on here that Stanford deems important, right? I have an AT&T phone plan, so I get service where AT&T feels like I get service. If I want a new app, I get it from the App Store, right? That's also a system that was designed. Like we are part of these systems. Of course, there's the technology that powers everything on here too. So both the existing and the emerging technologies. So like if you text message me and we're not friends a lot, like my name's gonna autocorrect. Carissa's gonna autocorrect to carrot or carcass. And it's like it's one of those things, but like you do it enough, right, and it learns, right? Because somebody designed both the data set that said my name's not in the Western canon of names and needs to be autocorrected. And somebody also designed this algorithm that says, well, she's fixed it enough times that I've learned. Right.
Right.
So the data, the tech, the product, the experience, the system, all design work, all has implications in the world. Right. And so like we know that there are programs, there are apps on this phone that have enabled people to band together around the world and like make change and rise up against their governments in really positive, wonderful ways. And those same things have enabled like massive school bullying. And so like and I guarantee that nobody sets out to create something that causes harm, right? But what we make has consequences. And
Yeah.
so when I say design, when I think about what we teach at the D school, like it's that full stack from the itty bitty data decisions all the way up to the implications of what that means to be out there in the world. You
Um,
you
Go
can
ahead.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to follow up and say, you asked me about design thinking. And like I don't think I get mired in words. I think that you put something out there in the world, like, and all of us do, whether you're that parent, right? Like designing the flow of your children's camp schedule and picking people up, to you're designing the meeting, to you're designing the technology. Like you're, if you care about what you put in the world, you're a designer. Design thinking was a really, I think, a great way to welcome a lot of people into creativity. There's a lot of debate over, I don't know, the semantics of it, and I don't see it. I think, like, come on in, everybody. That doesn't devalue expertise, that people that practice design full time have. I think there's room for everybody.
I think that's a really, really beautiful and pluralistic way of thinking about it. And I do think that I remember the first person who sent me a design article was a client who was super excited about design thinking. And I thought, oh my God, in ad agencies, we've been doing this forever. Like
Yeah,
this was our process. Like,
yeah,
I was actually a bit jealous that Tim Brown and those guys at IDEO had gotten like the
yeah,
trademark, quote
yeah.
unquote, on it. And I was like, ah. But I do think it invited other people into this way of thinking more holistically and hopefully somewhat more systemically around the inputs and outputs of things. And so I thought that that was useful. And to your point, help people understand that design was not only the physical object, but it was all those other component parts around it, in and around it. So I think that that is useful. I think there's this interesting question now about human-centered design and life-centered design, and now trying to put like more and more descriptors on so that we think about things more broadly, even in our lived environment and with our the planet that we're all a part of. So I think we do get caught up sometimes in the vernacular, but I do think it's important that people think about it consciously. Really, I think that's really what intentionally thinking about how these things fit together.
Yeah, I
So
think you hit the nail on
actually,
the head. Yeah, the intention is key, right? It's like words matter too, right? Because words can welcome people in or keep them out. But
yeah.
I do think we often worry, we over-index on the words and not the intention. And how do you find that right balance?
Well, I was curious about the students that are coming in now, both on the undergraduate and graduate level. What are they most curious about? Like, what is drawing them to the D school, and what are the questions that they're interested in answering?
I think the best way that actually was my colleague Scott, who co-wrote this new book with me. He like had this one-liner realization of how we describe it, and I think it's exactly right, so I'll share it. Which is that maybe 10, 20 years ago, we saw students coming in wanting to make things, and now they're coming in wanting to make change. And
Oh,
so it's like that shift in framing. And because, right, what enables that though is because we live in this world where anybody can really make anything, and like those tools never used to be as widely accessible. And now that they are, like, designers have a lot of power, which comes with a lot of responsibility. And the thing that keeps me excited, right, is like those students are taking that seriously.
I think it's an extraordinary moment in time, and this is why I was going to ask you in a minute about like sort of why the book now. But there is, I think you and I share that there's something really, really provocative happening like right now, right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another friend of mine, Worley, who is really big in the quantum space, who gave a talk recently about the democratization of innovation.
Mm.
This idea about being able to go change anything, right? Whether again it's something physical or it's something more systemic. Um, we have more and more access to be able to go do that. And you think about that and what you're doing with machine learning or AI, or again, what I'm interested in with the distributed web. Like all of a sudden, it feels as though we have so much more access to be able to go do something. And Worley's point of view is that we'll be able to like literally prompt, you know, thoughtfully or successfully, almost any kind of machine to create any kind of thing that we want to go do, from citizen scientist to citizen artist to citizen musician to citizen, whatever business plan creator.
Yeah.
So how much is that impacting it too? That there's just it's this massive acceleration or this moment of exponential impact.
I mean, I think that's like a perfect way of saying it. Um, what's fascinating, I think, around this concept of speed and pace is that we're still learning how to navigate it,
Oh my
right?
God, yeah.
So, like, the right now in the world, the people that create the technology really are setting the rules for how that technology is used, who uses it, who accesses it, what we make from it. I think we need to shift that narrative, right? Like,
Say it as plainly as you want.
you
Yes.
know, like if we want the tech to represent all of us, it has to be created by all of us. And and I'll say at the same time, my other mantra is you don't have to know the code. You don't have to be that person that codes the algorithm, but you have to know what that code can do.
Yes,
So how do
exactly.
you gain that material literacy in how these exponential technologies are working? How do you know like that using blockchain can fundamentally reorg a system, right? Like it's like you just need to know, like if you don't know that plastic's a material, you never think to use it. The same way with these exponential technologies, these emerging technologies, like we need to know what they can do. And all this is on all of us to figure out ways to be able to talk with each other in plain speak about what this tech can do. And I think like that's the work right now is getting all of us in the conversation.
100%. There's two thoughts. One is that I got to hear Brene Brown recently
Mm.
speak to a big group of HR people, and again, there's a lot of people who go, "Oh, that's not for me," and she's like, "No, the AI people need the people." And
Yeah,
so I have used that and replicated
I
that
love
sentence
that.
over and over again to people who think, "Oh, that's not for me." I'm like, "No, no, no. We all need the people, or the artist
Yeah.
people, or whoever fill in the
Yeah.
blank people to join in with that." But my experience or my metaphor for that was that, my oldest son is an aerospace engineer, and he has explained to me how planes fly 1,000 times, and I still couldn't tell you like how the whole like lift thrust thing works.
Yeah.
But you do understand that if you can get from here to there faster, what that means, right? As planes became more, and then you recognize, well, gosh, if we can do that, what that does in terms of changing time and space, but also the systems that are needed, right? We need safety checks, and we need ticketing systems, and we need ways for people to coordinate, like what time they're going to be picked up and what time they land, and like you understand all the stuff like above the technology line, right?
I
As
love
opposed to
that.
necessarily all the other stuff, and so that's where I try and concentrate. Is like I don't need to know how it's built or even necessarily how it immediately works, but I need to understand the impact it's going to have and how we all use it successfully together.
Right. And I think let me just build on your beautiful example there. We all know when a plane fails, when it crashes, right? When it can't take off because the wings are full of ice. Like we see the effects of when something goes wrong.
Yeah,
The scary thing about a lot of these emerging technologies is that they're invisible, right? And
yeah.
they're invisible, and so it's hard to know that something goes wrong until we like later on see the multiple after effects of it, which is why we need to be versed, upstream in what's happening as much as possible too.
Totally. I mean, that's why I was so excited actually to dive into your book. Because I was like, now I know again why Chris and I connected so quickly when we were in Zurich together. Because it's like our minds are so similar
I
in terms of how
totally
we think
agree.
about this. And so I'm just going to do a little like brief, sort of segue into the book, Assembling Tomorrow.
Mhm.
And I love the way you had the subline, right, which is about a guide to designing a thriving future. So I like the fact that you've tried to make this not as pragmatic, I guess, or as accessible for people as possible.
Mhm.
Um, and we'll talk more about your co-author and the fact that you've got these amazing illustrations that are part of it that were done by a real human.
Yes.
So not an AI artist that you worked with on this, but a real human that you worked with. But I will just say the first opening quote, which is one of my favorite pieces of this, which is that it may be that it may be that what we have is a world not on the verge of flying apart, but an uncreated one, still shapeless fragments waiting to be put together properly. And that was by Catherine Ann Porter, who wrote an article, I guess, for Mademoiselle about the future is now in 1950.
Mhm.
Like, how amazing is that to describe where we still are right now, 75 years or 74
Isn't
years
that
later?
wild? So that comes from this essay, The Future is Now, that she wrote. And in the essay, she describes being in her apartment and having read an ad or like guidance in a magazine about what to do should and there be a nuclear attack, an atomic bomb.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like some of the guidance, right, is like, well, one, like try to find a shelter, and if not that, go to a basement, and if not that, just hide under a table, right? And she's kind of like reflecting on how like futile that feels, and she's like, for us. She looks across the street, and in an opposing apartment, she sees a young guy sanding a table in his apartment, like really putting just like his mind into the work of like this beautiful craftsmanship. She's just having this realization that we, like we have to care about this moment. Like anything can happen, right? And it's great to be prepared for like what might happen, but that like we are still incomplete and we can still create a better future. And like maybe we just need to recreate it in a new way. It's like it's one of my favorite essays of all time, and I just
Yeah, I need to go dig it out. Actually, I would love to read it. What was her background? Do you know what she was just a
I actually don't know
author?
her
Yeah.
background proper. Yeah, she may
No,
be
just
essayist, but I'm
curious.
not sure. I'm not sure.
But I just think it was interesting that we were thinking about the future back then,
Mhm.
right? There were many, many people that were thinking about it. It was great to see again a female voice in it because we always hear about Marshall McLuhan and everybody else who was theorizing about it back in the day. Um, but I think the question is, again, where if my math is right, 74 years later, are we really proud of the decisions that we've made along the way? And do we wish that we'd paid a bit more attention to it? And where do we think that we can correct now? So I think what's again fascinating about your book is that the very first paragraph takes us into 70 years from now, and then
Mhm.
invites us to look 70 years past, right? That we were in this moment in between these two timelines. Again, I go back to now I understand your background around time, then I understand your history. But it's just interesting to see, why, I guess my question is, why do we think it's going to be different now as we look ahead than I think it has been in the past 70 years? Like,
Well,
what gives us more confidence that we're going to figure this out better moving ahead?
I mean, I think, you know, I don't know if we will figure it out. I think the reality is we will never figure it out, but we can get better at being aware of what might go wrong. Um, I'll spoil ahead to where we land in this book,
Yeah,
which,
yeah,
which is that everything breaks, right?
yeah,
And no matter our best of intentions, everything you put in the world, it may work as intended, but it alters something, right? It displaces some person. It just affects what's around it. And we need to both put things into the world knowing that's going to happen and shepherding them forward when things do go wrong in a way that doesn't impact people or the planet for the better. And the more that we get better at like seeing our consequences and potential effects at the same time as creating, like I think that's the differentiator from maybe where we were 70 some years ago.
So is that a consciousness raising thing? Is that a systems, understanding thing? Is that a more responsible for each other kind of thing? Like, what do you think creates that
Mhm.
understanding or that awareness?
That's a great question. I mean, at an individual level, I think we all were feeling more empowered because of what we were talking about earlier, where you can make anything. So I think like we're all feeling like we can have more agency. So I think that's a possibility. But I also think we do need top-down legislation too, right? There's a lot of things we don't have in place yet to help this come to pass in a healthy way. How do we slow the effects of like new technologies being launched? How do we put speed bumps in place so that things have to go through hurdles before they're released into the world? Well, this is a mix of I think we have the agency to do it, and we're not there yet. Like I don't think
Yeah.
we're ready. I think we need to come up together with like what are the ways that we can do this in a healthy way.
Well, and I do love again that you've titled the bunch of speculative short stories that go throughout this book, right? The history of the future of another friend who used to talk about the history of the future. So the idea is that we can kind of like look back and understand, and what have we learned from the past that we could actually also bring into the future. Like there is to me literally, a timeline crossing thing. And so the question is, what have we become better at? And I think that I'm very optimistic about the future, and I do think that I do think there's this moment in time where something is shifting, and I talk about us moving out of the industrial era and
Yeah.
not describing this as the fourth industrial age. I just don't think that that's at all where we're headed. I think there's something much more exponential, much more transformative, greater sense of productivity in all different ways that it's going to drive. So there's something we call it for now, the XPT, the exponential productivity transformation,
Hmm.
right? It's like a big lofty title. But we're trying to say that to say, hey, there's something really like profound happening here. And I keep thinking if you drag our outdated industrial way of thinking into this era, that it's going to be part of accelerating those breakdowns. Like they're going to become much faster and much more dangerous because I don't know that we know how to constrain risk.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is, again, how much do you try and constrain it? How do you try and design it in a way? I just think this design question is a really, really provocative and interesting one about how does one learn from either nature or learn from the things in the past or learn from indigenous wisdom? Like, where are the places that show us
Hmm.
how to pattern? I think a lot about repatterning the future. That's the thing I want to start writing about, right? How do we repattern the future and not keep dragging in these patterns that I think are creating more of the breakdowns that we're in. So I don't know if there's a question in there as much as it is an observation of do we feel confident that we are learning enough or what is the breakthrough that's happening? And I think that to your point, what we're seeing is some of the breakdowns, which is driving the students to want to go become change agents in the world, which is phenomenal, right? Not just extractors, but actual contributors. I think that's a big, huge shift that's happened.
Let me pull. There's so many threads I could pull from what you just said
Thank you,
real
because I'm just like, ah!
Let me try a couple. One is you mentioned that in the book we have these speculative fiction pieces throughout, and like the reason for that, right, is because of the importance of imagination and really stressing that like we need to try on these future worlds and see how they feel for us. And the pieces that are in this book are really about moments in the future, right? So there may be, a conversation in the future, and like you can get some of that outer context. And they're meant so that like you read some nonfiction and then it's like, oh, okay, let me try on what this might look like in real life. Because that like trying on and imagining, right? That's a work of a designer
Mhm.
too. Because everything needs to be designed. I mean, imagine before it's designed, right? Like everything created begins as a fiction. So like that stressing that skill feels really important. One of the stories we have in here is called the Data Zero Top 10, which is essentially like a little news report somewhere in the future of these categories of things that people have chosen to go what we call data zero on, which is
Yeah,
like, I'm not going to be tracked
right.
by the systems anyway anymore. So like you may think of like your location's always tracked, right? Our spending habits are always tracked. And we imagine a bunch of those that some of which are currently tracked, others that are not, um, and list them out. And so a question I love to ask the people, so I'll ask it to you is like what would you go like what do you want to go data zero on? What worries you about what's being tracked about you right now? What would you eliminate?
It's really funny because I think of myself as very libertarian in this fact, which is I don't want to be, and I'm always want to opt out of every single one of these things that
Yeah,
anytime I don't give access to any of my data if I'm given the opportunity. And even
yeah,
sometimes I go and track the privacy statements and go and do it there, which pisses me
yeah,
off. I have to work that hard to go do it.
yep,
And I have very, very little smart technology in my home for that reason. Like I just
same.
don't want to partly be tracked or partly be dependent on it breaking down and like
Yeah,
not being able to like literally unlock my front door. I made sure that I had a key that I could put in my front door, even though I've got a smart lock.
yep,
So I think it's more. I'm all about. I don't want any of my data individualized. I guess is basically the way I think about it. Right. I want to be able to contribute to the big data set that exists, but I don't want it to be necessarily come back to me. When we did the 23andMe thing, I let my kids do it from an ancestral point, but I wouldn't let us do it from a DNA point. I made sure that our stuff would be destroyed. And my kid literally sent me a video about how they take it, put it into a blue trash can, and do yada yada yada. So
yeah,
get rid of your stuff. And yet somehow I still keep getting updates about my data. I'm like, you're not supposed to be able to do that.
yep,
Right. So unfortunately, I don't trust the systems well enough. So I'm a very I try and I guess the question is, what would I give permission to? And this is where I get excited about the distributed web and other ways in which we could build these technologies, where I would then have more agency to be able to say, hey, you can use my data for this, but then I want to pull it back. Right? Or I give you this much, insight because you're going to be part of a study or going to be contributing to something, but then you can't sell it, you can't do anything else with it. And again, eventually, to some extent, I can close that portal, because I think the reality is right now, once you open it, you can never close it. And I think that part of the systems design thing is that it's an all or nothing. The what do you call it? The opening, the valve is the
Yeah.
wrong direction. And I want the valve to go the other direction. So
Yeah. Yeah.
interested. So it's a long-winded way of saying, um, uh, less is more in my world. But I think that the point you make in that thing is that there's so much that we're going to not be able to go do. And I think there were two things that were actually really profound. I wrote them in my notes around, I don't know if it was that essay or another one, but one is that you can go back in time and eventually go track all the decisions that your grandparents or your great-grandparents made,
Right? Isn't
right?
that wild?
My middle son right now, the cicada hunter, is now in Denver interviewing my 90-year-old dad before his birthday. My dad's birthday is at the end of the month, and we're going to try and do a little video. And so he's there recording some stories that my dad is telling him about his past. Right now, that's the only access to lose decision making, right? Is that we have the benefit of being able to sit down with him and let him tell all his stories. But in the past, my children will be able to go and see literally not only the decisions that I made financially or that I made, however, but also what I even ate at some point, right? If we're going to start tracking all of our gut decisions and we start wondering that there's like some weird allergy that's going through our family, we will know whether or not it started, in 2000, whatever, 22.
Exactly.
We're trying to figure it out in 2092. So I think that is really, really profound, right? Is that we don't recognize that this footprint that we're creating is actually going to be a map to something for our children or grandchildren in the
I know,
future.
like, what does privacy even mean anymore? Right? Like, I think like my biggest fear is having my innermost thoughts known.
Well, that was it. So then the other one was the gut reaction thing. I was like,
Yeah.
those are the two that I wrote down, right? The way in real time to be able to measure what was going on in my gut. Is that what you were proposing?
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yeah, your gut reaction emotions, right? Like, absolutely, like just to know. There's things that feel like because they're inside me that they should be mine, right? And we already see, I'm wearing this thing on my wrist too, right? That like at least collects like rudimentary information about my body systems. But like people are developing technologies to do a lot more than know my.
Right. Well, and so then that becomes an interesting systems thing, yeah, because even if that is just your data, right, and you get to have it and you get to access whatever Apple creates with some sort of, privacy thing around your heart rate or whatever. I do love having that data and I like having
Yeah.
it tracked against potential norms and whatever.
Yeah.
But the fact that they found out actually that there was a group of soldiers in a hidden portion of the world that no one was supposed to know that they were there because they were tracking their watches, right? Because someone could see satellite ways
Yeah.
that all the watches were there. That even if it's not that they don't know that Carissa Carter is there, they know that there's people there that then get put in danger because that data was emanated in a way
Yeah.
satellite ways that no one realized that someone could pay attention to. So that's the stuff too that we just don't have any kind of real preparation for, I think, as we head in. And I think, again, we start talking about your age children, right? Again, 9 and 11, their relationship with data and privacy versus my own children's relationship versus my relationship with it, right? Like, where are we going to feel like this is just how the world is working, and this is how I get what it is that I get, or start to question some of the systems and push back on them and say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Like, let's
I mean, like where the data pools is where power lies, right? And I think we're at a world right now where big tech companies are just kind of aggregating what they can, whether or not they know what they're going to do with that in the future. Another example of that it's in a different speculative story in this book towards the end is around it references this world where we actually mine our landfills literally for things that used to be trash, and now we have the technology to extract what might be treasure. So let's assume that technology exists and that's a thing. Who like does are we living in a world right now where places like an Amazon are going to start like realize that that's a possibility and start purchasing landfills, right? Like
right, who has
who
access to
owns
that?
that? Yeah, like who owns that value? Is it the person that threw out the trash to begin with? Is it the community that, you know, lived next to the landfill for years and likely, like had a lower, value to their real estate because they coexisted there? Or is it going to be, again, the tech company that has the power to, own the potential for what's in there, right?
Right. What a
All
great metaphor too, right? For all the data, right? That seems useless now that at some point someone's going to
exactly.
decide to go do something with. That's great. No, I think that's, I mean, although I keep saying that he who holds the algorithm will have all of the value,
Mhm.
right? And I do think it's he, because that's what we're seeing right
Yep.
now.
Yep.
And this is where I go back to again how we distribute it. And what I was hoping is that someone is coming to the D school and having conversations. By the way, that's my 13-year-old dog who's snoring. You can probably hear him.
I can't hear him.
Oh, good. I can hear him really loudly here. But is thinking about economic systems of distributing this productivity, right? I think that that's a really because that's really partly the question you're asking right there, which is like now who owns it, but then who has the value and how's that value created? Because even if it was the tech company that decided that they want to go do that, the question then becomes how do they redistribute that? Do they go back and give some money to the community or some value creation to the community? They use that data to somehow impact the bigger systems around them. So I think that they're partly it's who owns it, but then I think it's also partly what someone does with that and what are the
Yeah.
value that is created.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
it?
Well, mhm.
That's a big question that is in my head and my world right now. Because I've never ever been anti-technology.
Mhm.
I don't want to go back in any point in time. I don't think there was ever a place that it was better than it is now. So that's what gives me confidence about the
Yeah.
future, right? However, I do think that there are times that we've been really, really cruel and horrible to each other and times that we have not. And so I would like to, accelerate the things that I think are taking really good care of us and blunt the things that are not. And so to have more visibility into that and a more shared understanding around that. And I think one of the big key things, again, around why people are trying to change the world a bit is that in my lifetime, the population on the planet has doubled.
Wow.
That's a pretty profound thing when you think about it,
That is wild.
right?
Yeah.
It goes from 4 billion to 8 billion in the time that I've been here.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
nuts.
so whether or not it won't hopefully double again, that would be pretty fantastic. But whatever that meant, we just are much more aware of each other, right? And the resources that we are using. So what are some of the other trajectories that are hopefully going to impact what it is that we can see or not see about how we work with each other? Like when you look out to the future, what are the things that you think are some of the real forces or trajectories that we may not be paying full enough attention to yet?
W- We ask that to me a different way when you say it. Say it when you say like a
Well, I guess
four.
what I'm just saying is when you look at part of the thing that I think is so interesting is when people look at the future, they often
Yeah.
assume that the conditions are going to be the same as they are
Oh,
now.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
think that, we may be able to like do something with the data or do something, but I think the conditions literally are going
Yeah.
to shift and change, or consciousness is going to shift and change. So one condition was that population doubled, right?
Right. Right.
Another is that you start to see the degradation of things around you and you start to think, gosh, I need to be paying attention to that. Part of it is that as things become more the mundane tasks get done, I get to then elevate my consciousness or my awareness to other things, and suddenly we become much, much more thoughtful about whether or not animals communicate with each other, right? Back 100 years ago, no one was really worrying about that question or asking even that
I have a thought
question.
on that too.
Yeah, okay. It's a jump.
Okay, so I'll answer your conditions question. Let me just say really quickly, I do feel like our climate is that major condition of this current moment. And I live in California, in Bay Area, California, where we now have a fire season that we never used to have. And so no matter where you are on the globe, like guaranteed we're finally starting to feel the climate swerve, this idea that like as humans we have had an impact on our climate and have agency against it. And I feel like that's going to start being one of those major conditions for us creating going forward. You've mentioned talking to animals. Can we talk about like the privacy violation with that too? Right? Because like it's been all over the news. Like, oh, we can speak whale now for real. Like the crows talk to each other.
Elephants name their children, right? Yeah.
Right. But like there's there's this project called the Icarus Project, which is a real thing, which is like about this project where essentially they put these trackers on all sorts of animals and are now able to track where they are, in a way that at a level of resolution that we never could before. Because even if we could track animals, like they would hide, we wouldn't have constant connectivity to them. Um, which means that, like, yeah, we don't know all of their animal behaviors, but also it like kept something secret and private. And I feel the same way. Like, why don't they get that privacy?
Yeah.
Like we now know like that elephants have names for each other. Like, do they want us to know that they have? I just like I feel like there's this human hubris that like we get to know everything that I'm not. I don't know where I land on this yet. It
That's really,
makes
really
me uncomfortable. It really does make me uncomfortable.
well, and I think that in the book again, or in your thinking, right, you make
Yeah.
the connection to that, which is it's done to try and protect the animals, right? But to keep them from extinction. So the fact is
Yeah.
that we're doing it in this way that we can try and protect them, but the reality is that you end up losing privacy. It's the same reason that I think that the UK can justify that they track humans, throughout the entire city in order to try
Right.
and keep them safe in a certain sort of way. So it's like always been that interesting tension, and will continue to be. I think will get worse between privacy and protection, or privacy and
Yeah.
safety in
Yeah.
some way, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I look at it as if we can recognize that they're more sentient than we gave them credit for, hopefully we'll take better care of them.
Hmm.
Uh, a friend of mine in another book wrote again a little bit more about, Connor. He's written a book called We Are Agora, which I think is a really, really great read, and about how we are a superorganism as a humanity, not just with Gaia, but like literally as humans, we are our own superorganism, the way bees are in a hive. And he talks again about the consciousness and the awareness of that, which back to, again, not that long ago, we
Yeah.
were not giving babies anesthesia when we were doing surgery on them because we didn't think they could feel anything. Right.
Wow.
And at some
Oh,
point we go, oh my gosh, yes, babies actually do have feelings and whatever. And probably memories around that than the trauma that we just caused. So I think of it as that we'll become more sensitive if we're able to recognize that we are more connected with each other and we actually share certain properties like, communication, and that will make us better stewards,
Mhm.
neighbors.
I
So
like that. Hey, maybe you're convincing me to.
well, again, I mean, this is where we share the outlook, right? We are trying to look for the
Yeah.
best case scenario on this, and not the worst case scenario. But I think again, if you know that a whale is like screaming when you're about to kill it, right? Or like I have to think now. I only say whale because I know that there's an indigenous tribe who just won the right to go and now kill
Mm.
whales again as part of their heritage, and that's the one I feel confused on. Right, because on
Mhm.
the one hand you're like, God, I want to be able to grant people their rights back, and on the other hand, I'm like, oh, but have we not learned that that was not a good thing to do? Right. So
Yeah.
this is the challenging part about being again in a pluralistic society. But I
But
guess
we're
it's
having the conversation. Like I think the fact that even that we're duking out, like, is this okay? Is this not? Like, that's a step forward too.
that's true. Okay, that gives me hope. So I guess there's two questions I have as we sort of round out this conversation, because you and I could talk for many, many hours.
I could
And I
easily.
wait to come back up and like hang out with you. And I want to be
It'd
able
be
to have this
great.
conversation like for real. And I would love for you to meet Zane at some point, and for you guys to
But yeah,
get to learn more
likewise.
about your world. He was just in Palo Alto. But so we can summarize the book and the three things, the takeaways, which I think are great. But also, I'm curious as a mom, again,
Hmm.
as a person who is raising people who are in this future that you're writing and thinking about, how has it impacted how you raise them, or the conversations you have with them, or what do you think is most important for them to hold moving ahead?
I mean, it's. I think it makes me much more in tune. I mean, I think I'm very, and also I'm like, I'm a worrier. As a parent, I'm a worrier. And I'm also very like optimistic about the future, and I feel the importance of emotions. And I have my two children are very different in their personality. I'm also like, and I'm also being like quite conscious of how I talk about them here because of the whole data thing, and like what I
Fair.
say, it's like it's not sanctioned by them, but this will
Well, it's not
live.
like, so it's less
Yeah.
about them and more your approach, I think, too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like they each learn very differently, and so I have had to really, in as an educator myself, and somebody where like learning for me came like I got it. The school system worked for me. But now seeing like all these different ways that people learn, I think we live in this society now in schools, like they value the social emotional more. They, different types of like learning
Even the
styles,
creativity more. Yeah.
creativity more, right? And I'm having to like question, like I'm looking back on my own schooling and trying to think about like how does that apply to them? Where do I push and encourage them to go for it? And where do I let things play out? I think one phenomena I see as an educator in higher ed is that we're living in a world where high school students, when they're going to an elite institution, many of them come in like totally tapped out already.
Yeah.
They have worked so hard to get there, and then they arrive at college and they're burned out, which is that is so sad.
Yeah.
So as a parent myself with kids in the middle grades, it's like I want them, like where do I push and not? Like I think that's something that's not like a
Welcome to the
real
age-old question of parenting. Yeah.
right. Like I am an achiever. I love going for it. And I want my kids to find their own way, but also sometimes I know that people need nudges. So I think like that's something that I'm wrestling with right now. I also think that they're going to realize things that I think they're going to end up being smarter than all of us, right? Like in the same way that we're now more aware of the world, I'm trying to both craft the environment that they're going to live in, but also let them create it. It's like a very circular thing. Um, what advice would you give me? Right? Like you said, given that your kids are like, I think like 10 years older, right? Like you would, if you went 10 years back, right? Or if you like, if
Yeah,
you,
yeah, no, I feel, I think that tension is very real and it's
yeah,
existed for the time. And I think what it really creates is a humility around, we talk about systems change and we talk about all this stuff, but then when it comes to our own kids, suddenly we become very parochial again. And there's
yeah,
a
I
certain
know, right?
right? And learning to remember or to translate that back and sit there and say, no, if I really believe this, then I actually am also willing to break this. So I, had moved my kids from a very inadequate school district in Los Angeles, where it was like none of our needs were getting met, to specifically to Austin, so that they would be part of a school district. And I knew at my time, in the core of my heart, it was the best of the old system.
Hmm.
Like I just knew that it was going to be the end of that era of
Yeah,
education, but it was like the only thing I had because the new one hasn't emerged yet.
yeah,
I'm like, we're just going to have to play the game in this AP system,
yep,
right? And be
yep.
driven toward your grade point average and all that stuff. But I didn't necessarily push them toward the elite university. And I was like, there's a certain amount of like discretion in terms of who you are and letting that show up. Because I did think that that race to nowhere is sort of real. And I had read a book early on in parenting that was about teacups and Crispies.
Mm,
Right? That there were the two types that do make it through the system. They ended up as teacups where they're so sheltered and they can't
yeah,
handle any kind of disruption, or they're
yeah,
fried.
yeah.
And I didn't want to, so I think being again to your point, aware of that helps
Mhm.
us make more informed decisions. And Emma and I were talking about this the other day. Part of it is you don't know the greater system. When my oldest son was a senior in high school and had been a varsity wrestler for 4 years, he begged to bail out a state championship 6 weeks before. And I didn't even like, at first it wasn't even a consideration. Like there was no way that I even said yes, but there was a moment where I just said, well, why do you want to do that? And because I opened the door 1 inch, he like threw his body through it. Right. And we had this like long conversation. And at the same time, I'm like, no, because that's not what children do. I'm not teaching them responsibility. This is like, you have a team and you've got whatever. I'm reading articles about youth suicide and about how children feel like they don't have agency to be able to make the decisions that they want to make in their
Right.
lives. And they feel really out of control. And so I'm going like back and forth between mom and futurist and mom and futurist. And finally, I just said, well, honey, I'm just really worried that you're going to regret this. And he's
Uh-huh.
like, that if I do, that will be a really great lesson for me, mom. I'm
So
like,
wise.
touche, you win. So I let him do it. He dealt with all the consequences that came from that, right? All the coaches that were furious with him. And then years later, we started talking about it. And part of it, the reason he didn't want to do it is because there was a drug problem that existed on the team. And he didn't want to be away having to deal with the pressure of all that. I didn't know that,
Wow.
right? So who
Yeah.
was I to know that I knew better what was going on for him?
Yeah.
I do think really tuning in with, I guess my best advice is trust your own gut, but trust them. Like let them be a safe space to come to you with whatever's going on and triangulate and work it with them, as
Mhm.
opposed to the fact that we have to have all the answers and we know best about how this all works, because the world is changing so quickly around them. They're going to need a very different set of skills that we needed to navigate it. And there's 4 words that are stenciled on the wall of my house that across from a picture of like children from India. Hugo used to call it the Hall of Guilt. But you walk in and it's wonder, thank, do, repeat.
Yeah,
And I'm
wow.
like, if you just work on those 4, stay
Yeah.
curious, stay grateful, be in action, and repeat over and over again, right? Like that's it. I don't know what all the other skills are. I just know that those 4 will get you through.
I love that. I mean, it's beautiful. It
So.
really is.
Yeah,
It
and so
really
far, I have to say it's really worked out well. I have also 3 with very, very different personalities. They do recognize that they had to make it through this old system. I don't think they're fully prepared for the amount of ambiguity that sits now in the new world. My
Yeah.
daughter just got a 4.0 at UCSB because her grades are great, but like in terms of like, things having to be figured out, she's a little like, I don't know how to do
Yeah.
that. So I do think that your children have the advantage of being in a place where they're going to put things together like Minecraft, right? They grew
Oh,
up
yeah.
in something that was an infinite game, and they're
Mhm.
going to learn how to navigate a more infinite playing field and be in cooperation with each other. And the more that we can help them learn those skills, I think that the more confident they will be. And what we really want is a kid that just feels confident in that sense of agency that you talked about that students have. If
I
they
love
can,
I love that you just brought up the Minecraft example because I think that sparks for me like I think that at least both of my kids are well aware of sandbox mode of, like any game or, like creation tool, etc. Right? And I think that they apply that to their lives a lot more than I ever knew was possible. Right?
yeah,
Everything, oh, it's sandbox mode. I'm trying, I'm creating it, I'm trying it, and we're gonna see what works, and there's probably glitches. And
yeah.
I think that gives me hope too, right? Like they have that outlook.
Totally. And if they've been practicing that, that's a skill,
Yeah.
it's a
Mhm.
capacity that they've
Yeah.
had that we didn't get the permission to have or an ability to go do, which is what gives me, again, so much hope for this next generation. My biggest fear is that we just saddled them with just a tremendous amount of responsibility, which has
Yeah.
created a tremendous amount of anxiety. And
Mhm.
so I think we just need to be in better partnership with them. We are not loading them with all that and hoping that they figure it out, right? We're here, but we're co-creating with them and we're learning to design their lives with these tools and with these capacities that are really different than the ones that we had. So I am a big, yeah, I love the role that you're in. I think it's an exciting time. And I love that it challenges us to think differently too as parents. So that's
Well,
my,
I hope to like maybe you could come and like be on my shoulder at some key parenting moments where like I need like like when you're in the mix, you cannot see the forest through the trees. Like
totally. I
I
mean,
think
I have
it's
literally talked about making that an offering right now because
yeah,
I feel like that from so many parents that are going
yeah,
through it at this moment.
yeah,
Um, and I really do have like tremendous respect for the moment that you're in. And I do not have all the answers. And I wouldn't say I did what I did in 19, whatever, in 2010 is going to
yeah,
apply now.
yeah,
But I do think that there are some cores that if we just can go back to, then we're good. And just the same way you do with anything else, right? The way that you express it is different, but the
Mhm.
stuff at the center is all the same.
Yeah.
So I think it'll find its way. But yeah, I'm here anytime, baby. And I think I am going to, I might just create a Futurist Mom podcast. I'm like this close to
That
like
that
jumping
would
in.
be fantastic. We need
Okay.
that. We
All
do.
right. So then, to give you back the spotlight on your stuff. So if you want to close out, I do think you've done a really beautiful job again at making, even if I don't get through the whole book, or even if I just want to jump around in it, you made it very inviting. So that it'd be something that I get to just pull into when it is that I need to. But I love that you have like 3 key takeaways for us. Do you want to go through them, or do you want me to?
Well, why don't you say what you think, what you like about them, and then I'll fill in the
Well,
blanks.
I think that, the way that you laid it out, right, is that we accept that we have limits
Hmm.
and that design embraces constraints, which I know is a whole nother big topic that we didn't even get to. But I do think that
Yeah.
that's just important for us to remember that limits are not our enemy. Limits are the things that help us design things more thoughtfully. And the more that we can
Yep.
look at that,
Hmm.
um, the more information we get to be able to design better. You talked about it before. Appreciate that everything breaks, and that's
Yep.
okay. We just can take
Mhm.
advantage of partly take advantage of the cracks, but I think that planning for the break or thinking as far ahead as you can for the break, I think is a really important thing. I think it's something we usually don't take enough time to do. And when you were talking before, there's a quote from Mark Twain that I use in all my talks that says, "You can't trust your judgment if your imagination's out of focus."
Yeah.
And so I think that this really speaks to that, right? If you can really, really imagine all the ways that this thing could go haywire, then it also helps us build more thoughtful things, is how I interpret what you meant by
I
that.
love that. And I'll say one more thing that you in the beginning of our conversation here, you talked about in your own work, seeing those larger patterns. Once you aggregate lots of people talking about a topic, you see themes. And something that a word that pops out for me that I've heard you use multiple times in your own book, in your own talking, thinking, right, is the word liminal, which is the spaces in between, right? I think that comes out for you quite a bit.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I wholeheartedly subscribe to that. And I think that's part of the ethos of like this book too, is like there's no absolutism, right? It is all about the interesting overlaps that happen when two disciplines come together, when two people have to reconcile, when we do have that limit or that constraint that pushes us in or pulls us out. There's no like every speculative story in here, they're not either utopian or dystopian, but they're in the in between. And I know you had a guest recently who was talking about that in between too, right? Like, I think we are, the more that we embrace that in between, like, that's like when we try to see it, we try to feel like what are the key characteristics of it? Like, that's what's going to help us build that better future. So,
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that comes again, that goes back to them having confidence that you know
yeah,
enough and that you don't have to have such certainty, right? Like all the component parts
yeah.
that go to being able to handle the liminal.
Yeah, and I mean, like the this book is broken into two parts. The whole thing's about this phenomenon of runaway design, right? Where the things we put in the world, like they really take off. And as we were talking about earlier, if something breaks, we may not know it right away, and it could have very very important consequences. The first half of the book is all about these forces that have made this runaway design world, but the back half is about, well, how do we take action amidst this? How do we halt or slow runaway design? And they're very they're techniques that are around embracing our own awkwardness and seeing possibility in another discipline and shape shifting and like really laying into disorientation and being okay with being uncomfortable, noticing what that looks like. They're all things that anybody can do, whether or not, again, like you hold the keys to the tech at this moment. Like we all really do have agency to create what comes next.
I think that that is a very, very hopeful piece. And I think that the last one was acknowledging that what we make matters. I
Yeah.
feel that's so, so strongly. I mean, I honestly I worked in the food industry, right, for many, many years before I moved into tech. And even then, I wanted them to pay attention to that, like what we're like literally that what we're producing, I can see has consequences down the line as we're seeing all this stuff around ultra high processed food. So tech is not the first time that we've had this conversation,
No, it's
right?
not.
And this is
Yeah.
the part that I think is super frustrating for me. We had this in the food industry, we've had it in the pharmaceutical industry, we've had this certainly in the military industry, we've had this in financial industry,
Mhm.
right? That what we make matters and has huge, huge implications. It's just that again, these are the thinking that we hopefully should have woken up to then that we could be bringing now into this technologically accelerated moment that I feel like we haven't quite fully learned. But if we could just learn that one, that what we make matters,
It
I think
really does, doesn't it?
we would treat it really differently. And we would intentionally be slower then, because then it would be less about this literally an arms race to try and get to, the largest language model
Yeah.
without understanding what that all means and what we do with that. So I think if anybody takes anything away from that, that would be great. I guess what is your hope for the greatest takeaway for the writing and the work that you're doing? Because your book is basically an extension of all the work you're doing in the D School, right?
I mean, I think I I want on the individual level people to be sparked, like really imagine wildly, right? And like really lay into their creativity, not outsource it to the AI. Um,
Or maybe
I want people
partnership.
to,
Can you do it in partnership with the AI or no?
I mean, I think you could. I think AI is a tool, right? And we'll get there. I mean, this would be a whole our second hour of conversation too about integrating AI with design work, because absolutely it's happening, and I'm not anti-AI at all. I'm about using it in like really interesting ways. Um, but I think my, hitting a takeaway is like, I want you to feel like your imagination matters and what you create matters. And that happens at the tiniest scale of like designing your day to day up to your chosen line of work, up to what we create as a collective, as women, as futurists, as designers, like whatever category, like all of those different groups that you identify with, like they need to be heard.
Absolutely, right. And we want more and more people into the conversation. So I think that I'm so grateful again that your email, this is literally the power of one email, one
I
e-blast, Carissa
love that
Carter,
you answered.
pulled us back together.
I know.
And that we get to follow your work more. And I might come back and knock on your door again and say, let's have this AI conversation, because I do think that that would be one that
Let's
people really.
let's do. And the next time you're in the area here, like it would be great to be able to catch up in person too, Nancy.
I would love to. And congratulations on the book.
So much.
Tons of great wishes for the launch of it. We will put a link into an e-blast or any communication around this as well, so people can find all the special parts of it that you have attached to it. And let's stay in touch.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Yay.
Thank you so much for having me.